Hello, welcome to Clarity and Brevity. Today I want to talk about some books on covenant theology. Now, covenant theology may be new to you, maybe you've read about it before, but I want to give a series of books from the easiest to a little more complicated, just a selection of 7 books here, and it's not all there is to say, but it may give you an idea of some places you can look to understand biblical theology, both from a biblical theological perspective, focusing more on the outworking of covenants in the Bible, and also a systematic theological appreciation, focusing on the organization of the covenants from a more systematic perspective. So here's a book here, one of the easier to read, as a short book, Tom Schreiner, Covenant and God's Purpose for the World. This book is focused more on the biblical data. You have the covenant of creation, covenant with Noah, covenant with Abraham, covenant with Israel, covenant with David, and then the new covenant. There's your table of contents. This is Crossway's Short Studies in Biblical Theology. It is 119 pages right there, and it's not a big book. You can see compared to the next book I have, it's smaller. It's not a big book, but it's a straightforward, well done, responsible understanding of the biblical data for covenants. So that might be a good place to get your feet wet on the topic. Another book that does a little bit more with the systematic is John T. Rhodes, and in America it's called Covenants Made Simple, Understanding God's Unfolding Promises to His People. I really like the British title for this book, which is called Raiding the Lost Ark. But this is going to get into the covenant of works. Now, what is that? Where does it come from? What does it mean? The covenant cursed, covenant conflict, Abraham and the covenant of grace. Now, you have covenant of works and the covenant of grace, so he covers both of those. Moses, David, the new covenant, the covenant of redemption, and then the covenant salvation, covenant people, and covenant life. There's your table of contents right there. And one of the things he does here is very approachable. He's got these little charts in here. You can see that. This is on the covenant of grace, and he has here the blessings and the covenant. So you have, this is the covenant right here, right? And then you have the covenant blessings and the covenant curse. He's got these little charts throughout. Here's the one covenant of grace as it expands and gets, that is, as it progressively is revealed. And so you got another one here, Abraham and his relationship to the covenant of grace. I like this little book here on covenants. So there's an option for you. This is a book that I wrote on covenants called The Path of Faith, A Biblical Theology of Covenant and Law. So there's the cover, published with InterVarsity Press in the Essential Studies of Biblical Theology. And in this book, I'm particularly looking at the relationship of law to covenant. And so I start with Adam and Noah, and then Abraham into Moses and Israel, David, the role of the prophets in the Old Testament, and then several chapters on the New Testament, the coming of Christ, the teaching of Christ in relationship to the law, Jesus and his work explained in Paul's letters and Acts, and then practicing the new covenant, and then the consummation of the new covenant in the book of Revelation. And I don't have as many charts, but I've got a few charts in here. Here's the Exodus chart. I've got one in here, 2 in here on how to understand covenant theology. This one right here gives you a sense of the relationship between the covenant of grace and the covenant of works. That's a sort of medium range book. It's a little bit longer. It's 180 pages or so, 169 pages. That's a medium length. It's got some meat to it, I think, but it's not the most complicated book. Now, another book that I like here is Richard Belcher, teaches at RTS Charlotte, The Fulfillment of the Promises of God, an Explanation of Covenant Theology. Now, what I like about this one is what he has done is gives an introduction to covenant theology, talks about the covenant of works in a chapter, the covenant of grace in a chapter, the Noahic covenant, then the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. And then he gets into modern debates about covenant theology. He talks about major and minor variations in covenant theology. He interacts with O. Palmer Robertson and John Murray, Dumbrell, Paul Williamson. He has a whole chapter on Meredith Kline. covenants as administrations of God's kingdom. So maybe you've heard about Meredith Kline. What is his view? Well, Belcher will go through that. He has an entire chapter just evaluating Kline's view of the covenants. Then he has an interesting couple of chapters towards the end. Chapter 12 is on confessional Baptists and how covenant theology works in that framework. And then he has an entire chapter, chapter 13, on progressive covenantalism and the way that works, which is a different take on covenant theology. And then he concludes the benefits of covenant theology, and he's got an appendix on covenants in the ancient Near East, and then an interesting appendix on the question of testament or covenant in Hebrews 9, 16, and 17. And so this is another sort of medium-range book, not the most technical, but it's plenty technical, but also plenty easy to read. In other words, there's a lot of meat in here. And so I like that book on covenant theology as well. Now, a recent sort of reference work, but it's also not too hard to read, is Harrison Perkins' Reformed Covenant Theology, a Systematic Introduction. This is published with Lexham, but I suppose it will now be coming out with Baker. He's got how many parts? 5 parts to the book. Part 1 is on the covenant of works. Part 2 is on the covenant of redemption. Part 3, the substance of the covenant of grace. Part 4, the administration of the covenant of grace. And Part 5, living in God's covenant of grace. And the total number of chapters here, 17 chapters. And one of the things that he does well is he thinks through the practical implications of this. And he writes as a pastor. He's got a PhD, but he writes as a pastor, and he understands the practical implications of covenant theology. This is a hardback book. It's pushing 500 pages, not quite 450 pages or so. What a really nice work here. He gets into some of the debates as well, and if you know where the debates are, you can see his position on some of the issues. Now, a couple of older works that get technical. One here, John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion. And now this is a big book, 2 volumes in standard translation. If you turn to book 2, which is in volume 1 of the standard edition most people have, this is the John McNeil, Ford Lewis Battles edition. It's in volume 1. Book 2, chapters 10 and 11. I like these discussions that Calvin gives on the similarities of the Old and New Testaments and the differences. And so chapter 10 of book 2 is on the similarity of the Old and New Testaments. And then if you keep reading, when you get to chapter 11, the differences between the 2 testaments. And you have there a lot of insights into the relationship of the covenants. How are they similar? There are similarities. And how are they different? Well, another take, and this is after Calvin, but somebody I've talked about before, is Francis Turretin and his Institutes of Elliptic Theology. And if you turn in Turretin to the 12th topic, so this is called the 12th topic and the 7th question, the twofold economy of the covenant of grace. So the 12th topic, the 7th question, and the 8th question. You're going to get a lot of very careful, helpful discussion here about the covenant of grace in its twofold economy. So how was it administered in the Old Covenant and then in the New Covenant? But talking about the covenant of grace in both respects. Now, and that's the broader topic. Hold on. So the broader topic there, the 12th topic, is the covenant of grace and its twofold economy in the Old and New Testaments. And I find questions 7 and 8 to be particularly helpful here. It's pages 216 to, 239 or so, maybe up to 240. Why did God will to dispense the single covenant of grace in different ways? In how many ways was it dispensed? And what was its economy? That's question 7. Question 8 is on the differences, how the Old and New Covenants differ from each other, whether essentially as to substance of doctrine or accidentally as to the manner of dispensation. We make distinctions, he says. So you can hear, even in the way the questions are posed, how carefully he parses out the questions. And if you read through that section, you're going to find a lot of help, I think, on the similarities of the covenant administrations and the differences as well. So that's 7 books. There's more books we could talk about. That's 7. And I can mention a couple of bonus as well. I haven't read Ryan McGraw's new book on what is covenant theology, but that's another introduction to covenant theology. And then another one you could look at as a bonus option here is the Westminster Confession of Faith, and see what it says about covenants and the relationship of the Old and New Testaments, for example, in there. So those are just a few books if you're interested in getting started or going further on covenant theology. Thanks for watching. I hope this is helpful. Remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.